We read in our gospel today that Jesus has taken his disciples on a retreat. Anybody here know what a retreat is like? Raise your hand if you've ever been on a retreat. Whether it's for work or for spirituality, it's meant as a time to come away and to learn something new without the work of shedding your old thoughts, right? A retreat space creates a sacred space and gives people the opportunity to consider again something which they've considered before. It's usually an invitation for a paradigm shift of some sort, acknowledging that our usual way of thinking isn't getting us to where we need to go. And so it is that Jesus has taken his disciples on a retreat. He's wanting them to understand what it means to be a part of his effort to bring about a new way. And we hear how they're having trouble with it. I think we would do well to enhance our understanding of the reading and the circumstances in which Jesus and his disciples found themselves if we consider the events that have happened in Afghanistan over the last month. We watched from a distance via our news of the Taliban slowly taking over the country. It's a tribal group, the Taliban, with a particular effort and idea in mind. So it was with Jesus. He too had a tribal group, a group of Jews who were committed, so they said, to helping him bring about the kingdom of God. And this was going to be a difficult thing. They had in mind what they would do. They were going to overthrow Rome. It was going to be a big job. And so maybe we can understand better why it is that his disciples are confused at his teaching. What do you mean you're going to be killed at the hands of the authorities and raised again in 3 days? You can also understand how they would be speaking just among themselves about who would be in which positions of authority in the new kingdom. For we do have illustrations of this that we have seen in recent news. Who is the second in command? Who gets which title? Who speaks to the public? Whose office is in which room, or who resides in which part? These were the questions that the disciples were trying to figure out as they were also wanting to learn how to follow Jesus. The history of the time of Jesus is complex. He lived for somewhere around 33 years, and there was much that came before him and much that followed. I'm not going to try to give a huge picture or a complete picture of the history, but I do want to give you an insight, a few cliff notes into that time. Herod the Great was the ruler when Jesus was born. He was known for having hundreds of his opponents executed. The brother of one of his wives, a Maccabean priest, accidentally drowned at a pool party. Her grandfather, the old Maccabean ruler, Hyrcanus II, was strangled. When Herod ordered his Hasmonean wife, Miriam, executed should he not return from Rome, she angrily responded by refusing to have sex with him. He had her tried and executed for adultery. Then he mourned that action and almost committed suicide. He also killed 3 of his sons. There was a pun in Greek that was said about Herod, who attempted to abide by Jewish law, which prohibited eating pork. And the pun circled around the word for pig and son, different by only a couple of letters. And it said, it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. This was the ruler when Jesus was born. When Herod the Great died, he put 3 of his sons in charge of the area that he had reigned. Archelaus, who became the ethnarch, the lower in status than king of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea in the south. Philip, who was named a tetrarch, slightly lower in status than an ethnarch, and he was of the largely non-Jewish regions northeast of the Sea of Galilee. And Herod of Antipas, who became the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea beyond the Jordan River. He's referred to as the king of Galilee in the gospel stories. He was finally exiled by the Roman Emperor Caligula. So we understand the social unrest, the political unrest during Jesus' time. These three men reigned, and after one of them fell, Pontius Pilate took that reign, which oversaw the region that included Jerusalem. Pontius Pilate was described by King Agrippa I as, quote, by nature unbending and severe with the stubborn, and was accused of the taking of bribes, wanton insolence, rapacity, outrages, countless and continuous murders, endless and most painful cruelty. This portrait of Pontius Pilate is not one that we see in the Gospels, but the first-century Jewish historian Josephus confirms what we hear King Agrippa I say. It was a complex political situation. The Jews fared politically under the Romans and Herodian client pretty well. The Romans were sensitive enough to permit the Jews special exemptions from military service, from appearance in court on the Sabbath, from portraying the emperor's head on their coins, because Jewish law prohibited images, that is, idolatry, and from offering sacrifices to the emperor or deity, as a deity. But they kind of bent that last rule and said, okay, you don't have to make sacrifices to the emperor as a deity, but you need to make sacrifices for Caesar and the Roman nation twice daily. In the areas of heavy Jewish population, the Romans were not to represent the image of the emperor on their military standards used in religious practices. But this was also insecure. And so you can imagine that the urban poor and the rural peasants were doing what they thought might be needed in order to secure their rights and freedom under the oppression of the Romans. Modern sociological studies suggest that there might have been people that were social bandits, that is, rural bandit chiefs and their followers who rise from the ranks of the peasants, rob the rich, sometimes give to the poor, and sometimes find support among local villagers who hope for a better future. Yet such figures are sometimes recruited, supported, and protected by those in power, and thus they terrorize the populace in general, including the peasants. In ancient Palestine, the bandits may have been influenced by millenaria or apocalyptic dreams and hopes, although there is scarcely any evidence, mainly because apocalyptic ideas are preserved in the literature of literate scribes. These bandit thieves we read about when Jesus of Nazareth was crucified between two such as these. It was a hard life. Jesus was not alone in wanting to lead people to a new way, and his disciples had in mind what that might look like. That being said, we notice that the church in this world has been changing. Even as Jesus was bringing about a new kingdom, different than what the disciples imagined, there has been a union between Christianity and empires ever since Constantine. For hundreds of years, Christianity was carried into new lands on the back of empires. It is difficult to exaggerate the union between church and state. I've got to tell you the hard truth. Because even Constantine in the 300s, for 700 years, this was getting jockeyed out as missionaries went to new lands, brought with them their rule, and instituted a new religion. In the 1100s, this was so conflicting that the East and the West split. Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity split over it. Where was the center of everything was the ultimate argument. Was it Constantinople or was it Rome? And so we have the split in Christianity between Eastern and Western beliefs. This was further exaggerated in the 1400s when there was a papal bull that said, "Go into the nations where heathen are and convert them." And thus you see the movement of the Portuguese and the Spanish and the French and the English as they go around the globe conquering lands, looking for new ways to the Spice Islands where there is wealth. Connecticut is considered the nutmeg state because of trade in spices. And the island of Manhattan was traded with the Dutch for one of the spice islands that the British owned that the Dutch really wanted. This is the level of extreme. of how it is that the church was carried on the back of empires. And then you come to the 1600s when the Europeans were seeking some religious freedom, and they came to this land, still carrying the teaching of the people before them to go into new nations, to convert the heathen, and thus they sought to do that on the back of empire. And we know some of the brutal reality and history of this nation with indigenous people and people of African descent. It is hard to fathom. It makes me want to close my eyes and cover my eyes up too, both, so that I can just barely squint and barely open to behold the horrors that people committed for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, often in the name of the gospel. And so it is that we have to recognize this as bearers of the cross, to sit with this discomfort, to consider what it is we're being called to do now as we revisit the history of the people before us, our forefathers, and the ways in which they practiced in the world. One such story I want to share with you is in relationship to our desire to become a strong empire in the early days in the 1600s when Virginia was just a colony. There is a law on the books of a woman named Elizabeth Key, who was the daughter of a white man and a black woman. Her father was a Virginia legislator, part of the House of Burgess, and before he died, he wrote in his will that she was to be freed from slavery at the age of 15. That did not come to pass. She married a black freedman, and he knew something about English common law and brought to the legislature of this Virginia colony her defense. Because she was the daughter of a white person, a white man, and she was a Christian, English common law forbade her to be enslaved. The 1655 ruling ruled in her favor. But by the 1660s, the Virginia leaders had changed the law, saying that the status of a child was derived from the mother, and a Christian slave would not have to become free. They indeed closed a loophole, stating that people would be welcome to offer their slaves the sacrament of baptism without the risk of having to grant them freedom. This is the kind of history that makes me want to close my eyes and cover them up too, squinting, barely looking at the horror and the terror that was done. Why would they do this, our forefathers? Because they wanted to build an empire. The knowledge of history, often untold, can completely unsettle us. We can feel our chest tighten. We can feel a pit in our stomach. Our mind might grow cloudy so that we're unable to find a sense of direction for moving forward by the awareness that we now have. It's tempting in our overwhelmedness to become paralyzed and to want to cut ourselves off or to cancel that which unsettles us, including the church. Well, I want to tell you the glorious truth. I've already told you the hard truth, but I want to tell you the glorious truth. And the glorious truth is that the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, refuses to be captured by empire. Time and again, throughout all of these centuries, there have been men and women who have said, "Nuh-uh, that is not what the Bible says." You might read it this way or that way, but when you go to the teachings of Jesus, you cannot defend that perspective. People, time and again, throughout the centuries, have stood up to the authority of empire, often suffering great humiliation and sometimes death at the hands of the empire when they have challenged this union between empire and the Christian church. We know some of those people in our own Episcopal history. I want to introduce you to one person who you might not know, but you'll be excited to know because you know the name, John Jay II. We know John Jay. You can just go drive that way and you start to see things with his name on it. That would have been the first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And John Jay II was the son of a judge, both known for their opposition to slavery. John Jay II in 1839 was just 22 years old. And he began to challenge the Episcopal Church, his church, in its relationship to slavery. He published a manifesto entitled Thoughts on the Duty of the Episcopal Church in Relation to Slavery. This was in 1839. That same year, he learned of Alexander Crummell, a black man sponsored by St. Philip's Episcopal Church in New York City, a black congregation, to attend seminary and enter the priesthood. St. Philip's was founded in 1809 and supported by Trinity Wall Street, but it was not allowed any recognition in the Diocese of New York at annual convention. Alexander Crummell was an applicant to General Theological Seminary, my alma mater, which refused him. Generals said to him they would educate him privately so that he wouldn't show up on the school's student roster and anger financial supporters. John Jay II befriended Alexander Crummell in 1839, showed up at his door and said, "I will be with you." He supported Alexander Crummell financially and with friendship. Crummell eventually attended Yale and then Cambridge University and was ordained a priest in Massachusetts. For 8 years, John Jay II worked to have St. Philip's Episcopal Church in New York City recognized at diocesan convention. Every year for 8 years, he put forward a resolution to the diocesan convention to admit St. Philip's, to allow them to have a presence at the convention with a voice and a vote. I have been here, folks, 9 years. Imagine 8 years, every year for 8 years, he brought this resolution to the floor. At one point, the congregation where John Jay II attended, St. Matthew's in Bedford, which is right over there, they refused to send him as their church's delegate. They were annoyed at his unsettling of the way things are. But finally, in 1845, the convention voted overwhelmingly to recognize St. Philip's and to seat its delegates at convention. And this is the good news, that the gospel cannot be controlled by empire. It refuses to be bound and to be captured by empirical standards. The radical love of Jesus cannot be held back. Nothing can stop it, including empire, and that is what Jesus was trying to tell his disciples as he took them away to teach them. They would defeat the empire because the good news does defeat it. Over all of these centuries, all of these 2,000 years, men and women have voiced the radical love of Jesus and proclaimed the good news which Jesus came to proclaim, as he said in his hometown in Nazareth 2,000 years ago, quoting from the prophet Isaiah, "I have come to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This was what Jesus was to do, and his teaching has allowed people to do it over and over again as they seek to follow him. Our presiding bishop wrote a book, as you know, which we read together this past January, called Love is the Way. And in it, he has this radiating smile, which you can't help but be drawn to, but also to say, "Are you serious?" He would say, if he were here, I know he would say, "I know this is crazy, but yes, love does change the world." I know he would say that because he says it repeatedly in here, and he wrote a book before this one called Crazy Christians, which was all about the radical, incredible message of Jesus, that love does change the world. Love is the way. In today's Kickoff Sunday, we are remembering how it is we are working to do this together. For we know over these years that Christianity is not some glorious empire any longer. That time has fallen away, and for at least the last 50 years, 60 years, we've started to see it really crumble. The institution of the church, plagued by all kinds of wrongdoing, we have seen our authority in the society diminish. And yet, the good news is not diminished. The radical love of Jesus is still here to transform lives. It may not be glossy and shiny, but it will be glorious. And that is what we remember together as the people of St. Stephen's. On this Kickoff Sunday, we are coming together for fellowship and celebration. We will recognize the organizations that we support through our outreach committee, and we'll also recognize the things that we do together to help us grow in love of Jesus so that we might follow him all our days, which is hard now, but it's always been hard. Next Sunday, we will have a service called Youngest Among Us, Intergenerational Worship. We'll do this once a month. We will alter our service ever so slightly to make conscious awareness of the youngest among us. We realized as we reflected, lay people and staff together, that having church school run simultaneous with worship meant our children weren't in worship. Yes, they got to have an intimate experience geared toward their age. But when they got to 9th grade and they were asked to come to worship for confirmation, they hadn't been here. Unless they were an acolyte or maybe a chorister. We want to change that. We need our young people to grow up in our midst. We need to hear their sounds and their questions. We need to get comfortable with them unsettling us so that we can remain open to what God is wanting to do. We also, have a great program for young people, Global Philanthropy Leaders, that teaches our young people about economics and how it works in the world. They learn about the ravages of empire, and they realize a difference that they can make in loaning money to people who are unbanked in the world, folks who do not have a stable government, folks who do not have access to something that can help them grow their life. We also make possible for us peacemakers. Jane Lindenberg has led this effort, and she's going to offer a new opportunity this next fall. These are intergenerational opportunities, are various ways that we do outreach, that we show up beside those that are vulnerable or outcast and seek to support them. Yesterday, we allowed a tag sale to happen here that was for the benefit of a trans lifeline phone-in organization. We were a church that could do that without their fear of shame. This is what God has called us to do, to love our neighbors, and it calls us beyond ourselves. It definitely takes us out of our comfort zone, but it takes us into the embrace of Jesus. And that is what we're invited to do. So we will be raising money after this service because this is worth raising money for. There aren't other places in our society other than those of us that claim the gospel to learn to live the gospel and to love the gospel. We will also be starting our stewardship campaign next Sunday, and we're inviting you to become aware of how it is that you relate to money and think about money so that you can think about how it relates to the church. 70% of relationships are stressed because of money conversations, and that includes people's relationship with the church. So in a fun way, we will be inviting you to become aware of your money personality, using a tool that talks about money personalities. You'll see more about this in our electronic communications. This hopefully will help you see that we need all of us in this conversation of how to be the church. We need spenders and we need savers. We need security seekers and we need flyers. And we need, what's the other one? Risk takers. All of us are needed so that we might be aware of the movement of the Spirit, because God is not dead. God is very much alive, calling us out of this time into a greater trust to follow him. We are honest with ourselves if we admit that we are like the disciples and are confused about what Jesus is saying. But Jesus promises to not get too far ahead. Jesus promises that as we draw close to him, he will draw near to us. He comes with our consent. He offers us the invitation to follow him, but he will not drag us along. We have to say yes. Let us encourage one another in that through our worship, through our fellowship, because God needs the church to be proclaimers of his good news. Amen.